It had short legs, thick as tree trunks, with flat, horny feet. The smell coming from it was incredible. It was holding a large wooden club, which dragged along the floor because its arms were so long. The troll stopped next to a doorway and peered. It was holding a large wooden... It waggled its long ears, making up its tiny mind, then slouched slowly into the room. "The key's in the lock," Harry muttered. "We could lock it in." "Good idea," said Ron nervously. They edged toward the open door, with mouths dry, praying the troll wasn't about to come out of it. With one great leap, Harry managed to grab the key, slam the door, and lock it. Yes! Flushed with their victory, they started to run back up the passage, but as they reached the corner, they heard something that made their hearts stop. A high, petrified scream, and it was coming from the chamber they'd just chained up. "Oh no," said Ron, pale as the Bloody Baron. "It's the girls' bathroom," Harry gasped. "Hermione!" they said together. It was the last thing they wanted to do, but what choice did they have? Wheeling around, they sprinted back to the door and they turned the key, fumbling in their panic. Harry pulled the door open and they ran inside. Hermione Granger was shrinking against the wall opposite, looking as if she was about to faint. The troll was advancing on her, knocking the sinks off the walls as it went. "Confuse it," Harry said desperately to Ron, and, seizing a tap, he threw it as hard as he could against the wall. The troll stopped a few feet from Hermione. It lumbered around, blinking stupidly to see what had made the noise. Its mean little eyes saw Harry. It hesitated, then made for him instead, lifting its club as it went. "Oi! Pea-brain!" yelled Ron from the other side of the chamber, and he threw a metal pipe at it. The troll didn't even seem to notice the pipe hitting its shoulder, but it heard the yell and paused again, turning its ugly snout toward Ron instead, giving Harry time to run around it. "Come on, run! Run!" Harry yelled at Hermione, trying to pull her toward the door, but she couldn't move. She was still flat against the wall, her mouth open with terror. The shouting and echoes seemed to be driving the troll berserk. It roared again and started toward Ron, who was nearest and had no way to escape. Harry then did something that was both very brave and very stupid. He took a great running jump and managed to fasten his arms around the troll's neck from behind. The troll couldn't feel Harry hanging there, but even a troll will notice if you stick a long bit of wood up its nose, and Harry's wand still had been in his hand when he jumped. It had gone straight up one of the troll's nostrils. Howling with pain, the troll twisted and flailed its club, with Harry clinging on for dear life. Any second, the troll was going to rip him off or catch him a terrible blow with the club. Hermione had sank to the floor in fright. Ron pulled out his own wand, not knowing what he was going to do. He heard himself cry the first spell that came into his head. "Wingardium Leviosa!" The club flew suddenly out of the troll's hand, rose high, high up into the air, turned slowly over, and dropped, with a sickening crack, onto its owner's head. The troll swayed on the spot, and then fell flat on its face, with a loud thud that made the whole room tremble. Harry got to his feet. He was shaking and out of breath. Ron was standing there with his wand still raised up, staring at what he had done. It was Hermione who had spoke first. "Is it dead?" "I don't think so," said Harry. "It's just been knocked out." He bent down and pulled his wand out of the troll's nose. It was covered in what looked like lumpy grey glue. "Ugh! Troll bogies!" He wiped it on the troll's trousers. A sudden slamming and loud footsteps made the three of them look up. They hadn't realized what a racket they'd been making. But of course, someone downstairs must have heard the crashes and the troll's roars. A moment later, Professor McGonagall had come bursting into the room, closely followed by Snape, with Quirrell bringing up the rear. Quirrell took one look at the troll, let out a faint whimper, and sat quickly down on a toilet, clutching his heart. Snape bent over the troll. Professor McGonagall was looking at Ron and Harry. Harry had never seen her looking so angry. Her lips were white. Hopes of winning 50 points for Gryffindor faded quickly from Harry's mind. "What on earth were you thinking of?" said Professor McGonagall, with cold fury in her voice. Harry looked at Ron, who was still standing with his wand in the air. "You're lucky you weren't killed. Why aren't you in your dormitory?" Snape gave Harry a swift, piercing look. Harry looked at the floor. He wished Ron would put his wand down. Then a small voice came out of the shadows. "Please, Professor McGonagall, they were looking for me." "Miss Granger!" Hermione had managed to get to her feet at last. "I went looking for the troll because I thought I could deal with it on my own, because I've read all about them." Ron dropped his wand. Hermione Granger telling a downright lie to a teacher. "If they hadn't found me, I'd be dead now." Harry stuck his wand up its nose, and Ron knocked it out with his own club. "They didn't have time to come and fetch anyone. It was about to finish me off when they arrived." Harry and Ron tried to look as though this story wasn't new to them. "Well, in that case," said Professor McGonagall, staring at the three of them. "Miss Granger, you foolish girl, how could you think of tackling a mountain troll on your own?" Hermione hung her head. Harry was speechless. Hermione was the last person to do anything against the rules, and yet here she was, pretending she had to get them out of trouble. It was as if Snape had started handing out sweets. "Miss Granger, 5 points will be taken from Gryffindor for this," said Professor McGonagall. "I'm very disappointed in you. If you're not hurt at all, you better get to Gryffindor Tower. Students are finishing their feast in their houses." Hermione left. Professor McGonagall turned to Harry and Ron. "Well, I'd say you were lucky, but not many first years could have taken on a full-grown mountain troll. You each win Gryffindor 5 points. Professor Dumbledore will be informed of this. You may go." They hurried out of the chamber and didn't speak at all until they had climbed 2 floors up. It was a relief to be away from the smell of the troll, quite apart from anything else. "We should have gotten more than 10 points, Ron grumbled. 5, you mean, once you've taken off Hermione's. Good of her to get us out of trouble like that, Ron admitted. Mind you, we did save her." "She might not have needed saving if we hadn't locked the thing in with her," Harry reminded him. They had reached the portrait of the fat lady. "Pig snout," they said, and entered. The common room was panicked and noisy. Everyone was eating the food that had been set up. Hermione, however, stood alone by the door, waiting for them. There was a very embarrassed pause. Then, none of them looking at each other, they all said, "Thanks," and hurried off to get plates. But from that moment on, Hermione Granger became their friend. There are some things you can't share without ending up liking each other, and knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll is one of them. Chapter 11. Quidditch. As they entered November, the weather turned very cold. The mountains around the school became icy grey, and the lake like chilled steel. Every morning the ground was covered in frost. Hagrid could be seen from the upstairs windows defrosting broomsticks on the Quidditch field, bundled up in a long moleskin overcoat, rabbit fur gloves, and enormous beaverskin boots. The Quidditch season had begun. On Saturday, Harry would be playing in his first match after weeks of training, Gryffindor versus Slytherin. If Gryffindor won, they would move up to second place in the House Championship. Hardly anyone had seen Harry play because Wood had decided that, as the secret weapon, Harry should be kept, well, secret. But the news that he was playing Seeker had leaked out somehow, and Harry didn't know which was worse, people telling him he'd be brilliant, or people telling him they'd be running around underneath him holding a mattress. It was really lucky that Harry now had Hermione as a friend. He didn't know how he'd have gotten through all his homework without her, what with all the last-minute Quidditch practice Wood was making them do. She also lent him Quidditch Through the Ages, which turned out to be a very Very interesting read. Harry learned that there were 700 ways of committing a Quidditch foul, and that all of them had happened during the World Cup match in 1473. Harry learned that there were 700 ways of committing and fastest fouls, and that all of them had serious Quidditch accidents seemed to happen to them. Although people rarely died playing Quidditch, the referees had been known to vanish and turn up months later in the Sahara Desert. Hermione had become a bit more relaxed about breaking rules since Harry and Ron had saved her from the mountain troll, and she was much nicer for it. The day before Harry's first Quidditch match, the three of them were out in the freezing courtyard during break, and she had conjured them up a bright blue fire that could be carried around in a jam jar. They were standing with their backs to it, getting warm, when Snape crossed the yard. Harry noticed at once that Snape was limping. Harry, Ron, and Hermione moved closer together to block the fire from view. They were sure it wouldn't be allowed. Unfortunately, something about their guilty faces caught Snape's eye. He limped over. He hadn't seen the fire, but he seemed to be looking for a reason to tell them off anyway. "What's that you've got there, Potter?" It was Quidditch through the ages. Harry showed him. "Library books are not to be taken outside the school," said Snape. "Give it to me. 5 points from Gryffindor." "He just made that rule up," Harry muttered angrily as Snape limped away. "Wonder what's wrong with his leg." "Dunno, but I hope it's really hurting him," said Ron bitterly. The Gryffindor common room was very noisy that evening. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat together next to a window. Hermione was checking Harry and Ron's charms homework for them. She would never let them copy. How will you learn? But by asking her to read it through, they got the right answers anyway. Harry felt restless. He wanted Quidditch through the ages back to take his mind off his nerves about tomorrow. Why should he be afraid of Snape? Getting up, he told Ron and Hermione he was going to ask Snape if he could have it. "Better you than me," they said together, but Harry had an idea that Snape wouldn't refuse if there were other teachers listening. He made his way down to the staff room and knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Perhaps Snape had just left the book in there. It was worth a try. He pushed the door ajar and peered inside, and a horrible scene met his eyes. Snape and Filch were inside, alone. Snape was holding his robes above his knees. One of his legs was bloody and mangled. Filch was handing Snape bandages. "Blasted thing," Snape was saying. "How are you supposed to keep your eyes on all 3 heads at once?" Harry tried to shut the door quietly, but... "Potter!" Snape's face was twisted with fury as he dropped his robes quickly to hide his leg. Harry gulped. "I just wondered if I could have my book back." "Get out! Get out!" Harry left before Snape could take any more points from Gryffindor. He sprinted back upstairs. "Did you get it?" Ron asked as Harry joined them. "What's the matter?" In a low whisper, Harry told them what he'd seen. You know what this means," he finished breathlessly. "He tried to get past that 3-headed dog at Halloween. That's where he was going when we saw him. He's after whatever it's guarding. And I bet my broomstick he let that troll in to make a diversion." Hermione's eyes were wide. "No, he wouldn't," she said. "I know he's not very nice, but he wouldn't try and steal something Dumbledore was keeping safe." "Honestly, Hermione, you'd think all teachers are saints or something," snapped Ron. "I'm with Harry. I wouldn't put anything past Snape. But what's he after? What's the dog guarding?" Harry went to bed with his head buzzing with the same question. Neville was snoring loudly, but Harry couldn't sleep. He tried to empty his mind. He needed to sleep. He had to. He had his first Quidditch match in a few hours, but the expression on Snape's face when Harry had seen his leg wasn't easy to forget. The next morning dawned, very bright and cold. The great hall was full of delicious-smelling fried sausages and the cheerful chatter of everyone looking forward to a good Quidditch match. "You've got to eat some breakfast." "I don't want anything." "Just a bit of toast," wheedled Hermione. "I'm not hungry." Harry felt terrible. In an hour's time, he'd be walking onto the field. "Harry, you need your strength," said Seamus Finnegan. "Seekers are always the ones who get clobbered by the other team." "Thanks, Seamus," said Harry, watching Seamus pile ketchup on his sausages. By 11 o'clock, the whole school seemed to be out in stands around the Quidditch pitch. Many students had binoculars. The seats might be raised high in the air, but it was still difficult to see what was going on sometimes. Ron and Hermione joined Neville, Seamus, and Dean, the West Ham fan, up in the top row. As a surprise for Harry, they had painted a large banner on one of the sheets Scabbard had ruined. It said, "Potter for President," and Dean, who was good at drawing, had done a large Gryffindor lion underneath. Then Hermione had performed a tricky little charm, so the paint flashed different colors. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Harry and the rest of the team were changing into their scarlet Quidditch robes. Slytherin would be playing in green. Wood cleared his throat for silence. "Okay, men," he said. "And women," said Chaser Angelina Johnson. "And women," Wood agreed. "This is it." "The big one," said Fred Weasley. "The one we've all been waiting for," said George. "We know Oliver's speech by heart," Fred told Harry. "We were on the team last year." "Shut up, you two," said Wood. "This is the best Gryffindor's had in years. We're going to win. I know it." He glared at them all as if to say, "Or else." "Right. It's time. Good luck, all of you." Harry followed Fred and George out of the locker room and, hoping his knees weren't going to give way, walked onto the field to loud cheers. Madame Hooch was refereeing. She stood in the middle of the field waiting for the two teams, her broom in her hand. "Now, I want a nice fair game, all of you," she said once they were all gathered around her. Harry noticed that she seemed to be speaking particularly to the Slytherin captain, Marcus Flint, a sixth year. Harry thought Flint looked as if he had some troll blood in him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the fluttering banner high above, flashing "Potter for President" over the crowd. His heart skipped. He felt braver. "Mount your brooms, please." Harry clambered onto his Nimbus 2000. Madame Hooch gave a loud blast on her silver whistle. 15 brooms rose up high into the air. They were off. "And the quaffle is taken immediately by Angelina Johnson of Gryffindor. What an excellent chaser that girl is, and rather attractive, too. Jordan!" "Sorry, Professor." The Weasley twins' friend, Lee Jordan, was doing the commentary for the match, closely watched by Professor McGonagall. "And she's really belting along up there. A neat pass to Alicia Spinnet, a good friend of Oliver Wood's. Last year's only a reserve. Back to Johnson, and... No, the Slytherins have taken the quaffle. Slytherin's captain Marcus Flint gains the quaffle, and off he goes. Flint flying like an eagle up there. He's going to... No, stopped by an excellent move by Gryffindor keeper Wood, and the Gryffindors take the quaffle. That's Chaser Katie Bell of Gryffindor up there. Nice dive around Flint, off up the field, and... Oh, that must have hurt. Hit in the back of the head by a bludger. Quaffle taken by the Slytherins. That's Adrian Pusey speeding off towards the goalpost, but he's blocked by a second bludger, sent his way by Fred or George Weasley. Can't tell which. Nice play by the Gryffindor beater. Anyway, and Johnson, which back in possession of the quaffle, a clear field ahead, and she goes. She's really flying. Dodges a speeding bludger. The goalposts are ahead. Come on now, Angelina. Keeper Bletchley dives. Misses. Gryffindor score! Gryffindor cheers filled the cold air with howls and moans from the Slytherins. "Budge up there, move along." "Hagrid!" Ron and Hermione squeezed together to give Hagrid enough space to join them. "Been watching from me hut," said Hagrid, patting a large pair of binoculars around his neck. "But it isn't the same as being in the crowd. No sign of the snitch yet, eh?" "Nope," said Ron. "Harry hasn't much to do yet." "Kept out of trouble, though, that's something," said Hagrid, raising his binoculars and peering skyward at the speck that was Harry. Way up above them, Harry was gliding over the game, squinting out for some sign of the snitch. This was part of his and Wood's game plan. "Keep out of the way until you catch sight of the snitch," Wood had said. "We don't want you attacked before you have to be." When Angelina had scored, Harry had done a couple loop-the-loops to let off his feelings. Now he was back to starting around for the snitch. Once he caught sight of a flash of gold, but it was just a reflection from one of the Weasleys' wristwatches, and once a bludger decided to come pelting his way, more like a cannonball than anything. But Harry dodged it, and Fred Weasley came chasing after it. "All right there, Harry," he had time to yell as he beat the bludger furiously towards Marcus Flint. "Slytherin in possession," Lee Jordan was saying. Chaser Pusey ducks 2 bludgers, 2 Weasleys, and Chaser Bell, and speeds toward the... Wait a moment, was that the snitch? A murmur ran through the crowd as Adrian Pusey dropped the quaffle, too busy looking over his shoulder at the flash of gold that had passed his left ear. Harry saw it. In a great rush of excitement, he dived downward after the streak of gold. Slytherin seeker Terrence Higgs had seen it too. Next In a great rush of excitement, he dived downward after the streak of gold. Slytherin seeker Terrence Higgs had seen it too. Neck and neck, they hurtled toward the snitch. All the chasers seemed to have forgotten what they were supposed to be doing as they hung in mid-air to watch. Harry was faster than Higgs. He could see a little round ball, wings fluttering, darting up ahead. He put an extra spurt of speed. Wham! A roar of rage echoed from the Gryffindors below. Marcus Flint had blocked Harry on purpose, and Harry's broom spun off course, Harry holding on for dear life. Foul! Screamed the Gryffindors. Madam Hooch spoke angrily to Flint, and then ordered a free shot around the goalposts for Gryffindor. But in all the confusion, of course, the golden snitch had disappeared from sight again. Down in the stands, Dean Thomas was yelling, "Send him off, ref! Red card!" "What are you talking about, Dean?" said Ron. "Red card!" said Dean furiously. "In football, you get shown the red card, or you're out of the game." "But this isn't football, Dean," Ron reminded him. Hagrid, however, was on Dean's side. "They ought to change the rules. Flint could have knocked Harry out of the air." Lee Jordan was finding it difficult not to take sides. "So, after that obvious and disgusting bit of cheating—" "Jordan!" growled Professor McGonagall. "I mean, after that open and revolting foul." "Jordan, I'm warning you." All right. Flint nearly kills the Gryffindor Seeker, which could happen to anyone, I'm sure. So, a penalty to Gryffindor, taken by Spinnet, who puts it away, no trouble, and we continue play, Gryffindor still in possession. It was as Harry dodged another bludger, which was sent spinning dangerously past his head, that it happened. His broom gave a sudden, frightening lurch. For a split second, he thought he was going to fall. He gripped the broom tightly with both his hands and knees. He'd never felt anything like that. It happened again. It was as though his broom was trying to buck him off. But Nimbus 2000s did not suddenly decide to buck their riders off. Harry tried to turn back toward the Gryffindor goalposts. He had half a mind to ask Wood to call a timeout, and then he realized that his broom was completely out of his control. He couldn't turn it. He couldn't direct it at all. It was zigzagging through the air, and every now and then making violent swishing movements that almost unseated him. Lee was still commentating. Slytherin in possession. Flint with the quaffle, passes Spinnet, passes Bell, hit hard in the face by a bludger. Hope it broke his nose. Only joking, Professor. Slytherin score. Oh, no. The Slytherins were cheering. No one seemed to have noticed that Harry's broom was behaving strangely. It was carrying him slowly higher, away from the game, jerking and twitching as it went. "Don't know what Harry thinks he's doing," Hagrid mumbled. He stared through his binoculars. "If I didn't know better, I'd say he'd lost control of his broom, but he can't have." Suddenly, people were pointing up at Harry all over the stands. His broom had started to roll over and over, with him only just managing to hold on. Then the whole crowd gasped. Harry's broom had given a wild jerk and Harry swung off it. He was now dangling from it, holding on with only one hand. "Did something happen to it when Flint blocked him?" Seamus whispered. "Can't have," Hagrid said, his voice shaking. "Can't nothing interfere with a broomstick except dark, powerful magic. No kid could do that to a Nimbus 2000. At these words, Hermione seized Hagrid's binoculars, but instead of looking up at Hagrid, she started looking frantically at the crowd. "What are you doing?" moaned Ron, grey-faced. "I knew it!" Hermione gasped. "Snape, look!" Ron grabbed the binoculars. Snape was in the middle of the stands opposite them. He had his eyes fixed on Harry and was muttering non-stop under his breath. "He's doing something. Jinxing the broom," said Hermione. "What should we do?" Leave it to me." Before Ron could say another word, Hermione had disappeared. Ron turned the binoculars back on Harry. His broom was vibrating so hard it was almost impossible for him to hang on much longer. The whole crowd was on its feet, watching, terrified, as the Weasleys flew up to try and pull Harry safely onto one of their brooms, but it was no good. Every time they got near him, the broom would just jump higher still. They dropped lower and circled beneath him, obviously hoping to catch him if he fell. Marcus Flint seized the quaffle and scored 5 times without anyone noticing. "Come on, Hermione," Ron muttered desperately. Hermione had fought her way across the stand where Snape stood, and was now racing along the row behind him. She didn't even stop to say sorry as she knocked Professor Quirrell headfirst into the front row. Reaching Snape, she crouched down, pulled out her wand, and whispered a few well-chosen words. Bright blue flames shot from her wand onto the hem of Snape's robes. It took perhaps 30 seconds for Snape to realize that he was on fire. A sudden yelp told her she had done her job. Scooping the fire off him into a little jar in her pocket, she scrambled back along the row. Snape would never know what had happened. It was enough. Up in the air, Harry was suddenly able to clamber back onto his broom. "Neville, you can look," Ron said. Neville had been sobbing into Hagrid's jacket for the last 5 minutes. Harry was speeding towards the ground when the crowd saw him clap his hand to his mouth as though he was about to be sick. He hit the field on all fours, coughed, and something gold fell out into his hand. "I've got the snitch!" he shouted, waving it above his head, and the game ended in complete confusion. "He didn't catch it! He nearly swallowed it!" Flint was still howling 20 minutes later, but it made no difference. Harry hadn't broken any rules, and Lee Jordan was still happily shouting the results. Gryffindor had won by 170 points to 60. Harry heard none of this, though. He was being made a cup of strong tea back in Hagrid's hut, with Ron and Hermione. "It was Snape," Ron was explaining. "Hermione and I saw him. He was cursing your broomstick, muttering. He wouldn't take his eyes off you." "Rubbish," said Hagrid, who hadn't heard a word of what was going on next to him in the stands. "Why would Snape do something like that?" Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked at one another, wondering what to tell him. Harry decided on the truth. "I found out something about him," he told Hagrid. "He tried to get past that 3-headed dog on Halloween. It bit him. We think he was trying to steal whatever it's guarding." Hagrid dropped the teapot. "How do you know about Fluffy?" he said. "Fluffy?" "Yeah, he's mine. Bought him off a Greek chappie I met in the pub last year. I lent him to Dumbledore to guard the—" "Yes?" Hagrid said Harry eagerly. "Now, don't ask me any more," said Hagrid gruffly. "That's top secret, that is." "But Snape's trying to steal it." "Rubbish," said Hagrid again. "Snape's a Hogwarts teacher. He'd do nothing of the sort." "So why did he just try and kill Harry?" cried Hermione. The afternoon's events certainly seemed to have changed her mind about Snape. "I know a jinx when I see one, Hagrid. I've read all about them. You've got to keep eye contact, and Snape wasn't blinking at all. I saw him." "I'm telling you, you're wrong," said Hagrid hotly. "I don't know why Harry's broom acted like that, but Snape wouldn't try and kill a student. Now listen to me, all three of you. You're meddling in things that don't concern you. It's dangerous. You forget that dog, and you forget what it's guarding. That's between Professor Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel." "Aha!" said Harry. "So, there's someone called Nicholas Flamel involved, is there?" Hagrid looked furious with himself. Chapter 12. The Mirror of Erised. Christmas was coming. One morning in mid-December, Hogwarts woke to find itself covered in several feet of snow. The lake froze solid, and the Weasley twins were punished for bewitching several snowballs so that they followed Quirrell around, bouncing off the back of his turban. The few owls that managed to battle their way through the stormy sky to deliver mail had been nursed back to health by Hagrid before they could fly off again. No one could wait for the holidays to start. While the Gryffindor common room and the Great Hall had roaring fires, the drafty corridors had become icy and a bitter wind rattled the windows in the classrooms. Worst of all were Professor Snape's classes down in the dungeons, where their breath rose in a mist before them and they kept as close as possible to their hot cauldrons. "I do feel so sorry," said Draco Malfoy, one potions class, "for all those people who have to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas because they're not wanted at home." He was looking over at Harry as he spoke. Crabbe and Goyle chuckled. Harry, who was measuring out powdered spine of lionfish, ignored them. Malfoy had been even more unpleasant than usual since the Quidditch match. Disgusted that the Slytherins had lost, he had tried to get everyone laughing at how a wide-mouthed tree frog would be replacing Harry as Seeker next. Then he realized that nobody found this funny because they were all so impressed at the way Harry had managed to stay on his bucking broomstick. So Malfoy, jealous and angry, had gone back to taunting Harry about having no proper family. It was true that Harry wasn't going back to Privet Drive for Christmas. Professor McGonagall had come around the week before making a list of students who would be staying for the holidays, and Harry had signed up at once. He didn't feel sorry for himself at all. This would probably be the best Christmas he'd ever had. Ron and his brothers were staying too, because Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were going to Romania to visit Charlie. When they left the dungeons at the end of potions, they found a large fir tree blocking the corridor ahead. Two enormous feet sticking out at the bottom and a loud puffing sound told them that Hagrid was behind it. "Hi, Hagrid. Want any help?" Ron asked, sticking his head through the branches. "No, I'm all right. Thanks, Ron." "Would you mind moving out of the way?" came Malfoy's cold drawl from behind them. Are you trying to earn some extra money, Weasley? Hoping to be gamekeeper yourself when you leave Hogwarts, I suppose? That hut of Hagrid's must seem like a palace compared to what you and your family's used to." Ron dived at Malfoy just as Snape came up the stairs. "Weasley!" He let go of the front of Malfoy's robes. "He was provoked, Professor Snape," said Hagrid, sticking his huge hairy face out from behind the tree. "Malfoy was insulting his family." "Be that as it may, fighting is against Hogwarts rules, Hagrid," said Snape silkily. 5 points from Gryffindor, Weasley, and grateful it isn't more. Move along, all of you." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle pushed roughly past the tree, scattering needles everywhere and smirking. "I'll get him," said Ron, grinding his teeth at Malfoy's back. "One of these days, I'll get him." "I hate them both," said Harry, "Malfoy and Snape." "Come on, cheer up. It's nearly Christmas," said Hagrid. "Tell you what, come with me and see the Great Hall. Looks a treat." So the three of them followed Hagrid and his tree off to the Great Hall, where Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick were busy with Christmas decorations. "Ah, Hagrid, the last tree! Put it in the far corner, would you?" The hall looked spectacular. Festoons of holly and mistletoe hung all around the walls, and no less than 12 towering Christmas trees stood all around the room, some sparkling with tiny icicles, some glittering with hundreds of candles. "How many days you got left until your holidays?" Hagrid asked. "Just one," said Hermione, "and that reminds me, Harry, Ron, we've got half an hour before lunch. We should be in the library." "Oh yeah, you're right," said Ron, tearing his eyes away from Professor Flitwick, who had golden bubbles blossoming out of his wand and was trailing them over the branches of the new tree. "The library," said Hagrid, following them out of the hall. "Just before the holidays? Bit keen, are you?" "No, we're not working," Harry told them brightly. "Ever since you mentioned Nicholas Flamel, we've been trying to figure out who he is." "You what?" Hagrid looked shocked. "Listen here, I've told you, drop it. It's nothing to you what that dog's guarding." "We just want to know who Nicholas Flamel is, that's all," said Hermione. "Unless you'd like to tell us and save us the trouble," Harry added. "We must have been through hundreds of books already, and we can't find him anywhere. Just give us a hint. I know I've read his name somewhere." "I'm saying nothing," said Hagrid flatly. "Just have to find out for ourselves then," said Ron, and they left Hagrid looking disgruntled and hurried off to the library. They had indeed been searching for books for Flamel's name ever since Hagrid had let it slip, because how else were they going to find out what Snape was trying to steal? The trouble was, it was very hard to know where to begin, not knowing what Flamel might have done to get himself into a book. He wasn't in Great Wizards of the 20th Century or notable magical names of our time. He was missing too from important modern magical discoveries and a study of recent developments in wizardry. And then, of course, there was the sheer size of the library. Tens of thousands of books, thousands of shelves, hundreds of narrow rows. Hermione took out a list of subjects and titles she had decided to search, while Ron strode off down a row of books and started pulling them off the shelves at random. Harry wandered over to the restricted section. He had been wondering for a while if Flamel wasn't somewhere in there. Unfortunately, you needed a specially signed note from one of the teachers to look in any of the restricted books, and he'd never get one. These were books containing powerful dark magic never taught at Hogwarts, and only read by older students studying advanced defense against the dark arts. "What are you looking for, boy?" "Nothing," said Harry. Madame Pince the librarian brandished a feather duster at him. "You better get out then. Go on. Out!" Wishing he had been a bit quicker at thinking up some story, Harry left the library. He, Ron, and Hermione had already agreed they'd better not ask Madame Pince where they could find Flamel. They were sure she'd be able to tell them, but they couldn't risk Snape hearing what they were up to. Harry waited outside in the corridor to see if the other two had found anything, but he wasn't very hopeful. They'd been looking for 2 weeks after all, but as they had only odd moments between lessons, it wasn't surprising they'd found nothing. What they really needed was a nice long search without Madame Pince breathing down their necks. 5 minutes later, Harry and Hermione joined him, shaking their heads. They went off to lunch. "You will keep looking while I'm away, won't you?" said Hermione. "And send me an owl if you find anything." "And you could ask your parents if they know who Flamel is," said Ron. "It'd be safe to ask them." "Very safe, as they're both dentists," said Hermione. Once the holidays had started, Ron and Harry were having too good a time to think much about Flamel. They had the dormitory to themselves, and the common room was far emptier than usual, so they were able to get the good armchairs by the fire. They sat by the hour eating anything they could spear on a toasting fork: bread, English muffins, marshmallows, and plotting ways of getting Malfoy expelled, which were fun to talk about even if they wouldn't work. Ron also started teaching Harry wizard's chess. This was exactly like Muggle chess, except for the fact that the figures were alive, which made it a lot like directing troops in battle. Ron's set was very old and battered. Like everything else he owned, it had once belonged to someone else in his family, in this case, his grandfather. However, old chessmen weren't a drawback at all. Ron knew them so well he never had trouble getting them to do what he wanted. Harry played with chessman Seamus Finnegan had lent him, and they didn't trust him at all. He wasn't a very good player yet, and they kept shouting different bits of advice at him, which was confusing. "Don't send me there! Can't you see his might? Send him! We can afford to lose him!" On Christmas Eve, Harry went to bed looking forward to the next day for the food and the fun, but not expecting any presents at all. When he woke early in the morning, however, the first thing he saw was a small pile of packages at the foot of his bed. "Happy Christmas," said Ron sleepily, as Harry scrambled out of bed and put on his bathrobe. "You too," said Harry. "Will you look at this? I've got some presents." "Well, what did you expect? Turnips?" said Ron, turning to his own pile, which was a lot bigger than Harry's. Harry picked up the top parcel. It was wrapped in thick brown paper, and scrawled across it was, "To Harry from Hagrid." Inside was a roughly cut wooden flute. Hagrid had obviously whittled it himself. Harry blew it. It sounded a bit like an owl. A second, very small parcel contained a note. "We received your message and enclosed your Christmas present from Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia." Taped to the note was a 50-pence piece. "That's friendly," said Harry. Ron was fascinated by the 50 pence. "Weird," he said. "What a shape! This is money?" "You can keep it," said Harry, laughing at how pleased Ron was. "Hagrid and my aunt and uncle. So who sent these?" "I think I know who that one's from," said Ron, turning a bit pink and pointing to a very lumpy parcel. "My mum. I told her you didn't expect any presents, and... oh no," he groaned. "She's made you a Weasley sweater." Harry had torn open the parcel to find a thick, hand-knitted sweater in emerald green and a large box of homemade fudge. "Every year she makes us a sweater," said Ron, unwrapping his own, "and mine's always maroon." "That's really nice of her," said Harry, trying the fudge, which was very tasty. His next present also contained candy, a large box of chocolate frogs from Hermione. This only left one parcel. Harry picked it up and felt it. It was very light. He unwrapped it. Something fluid and silvery grey went slithering onto the floor, where it lay in gleaming folds. Ron gasped. "I've heard of those," he said in a hushed voice, dropping the box of every flavour beans he'd gotten from Hermione. "If that's what I think it is, they're really rare and really valuable." "What is it?" Harry picked the shining, silvery cloth off the floor. It was strange to the touch, like water woven into material. "It's an invisibility cloak," said Ron, a look of awe on his face. "I'm sure it is. Try it on." Harry threw the cloak around his shoulders, and Ron gave a yell. "It is! Look down!" Harry looked down at his feet, but they were gone. He dashed to the mirror. Sure enough, his reflection looked back at him, just as his head suspended in mid-air, his body completely invisible. He pulled the cloak over his head, and his reflection vanished completely. "There's a note," said Ron suddenly. "A note fell out of it." Harry pulled off the cloak and seized the letter. Written in narrow, loopy writing he had never seen before were the following words. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. A very Merry Christmas to you." There was no signature. Harry stared at the note. Ron was admiring the cloak. "I'd give anything for one of these," he said. "Anything! What's the matter?" "Nothing," said Harry, but he felt a bit strange. Who had sent the cloak, and had it really once belonged to his father? Before he could think of anything else, the dormitory door was flung open by Fred and George Weasley, who bounded in. Harry stuffed the cloak quickly out of sight. He didn't feel like sharing it with anyone else yet. "Merry Christmas!" "Hey, look! Harry's got a Weasley sweater too!" Fred and George were wearing blue sweaters, one with a large yellow F on it, and the other a G. "Harry's is better than ours, though," said Fred, holding up Harry's sweater. "So she obviously makes more of an effort if you're not family." "Why aren't you wearing yours, Ron?" George demanded. "Come on, Get it on. They're lovely and warm." "I hate maroon," said Ron, who moaned half-heartedly as he pulled it over his head. "You haven't got a letter on yours," George observes. "I suppose she thinks you don't forget your name, but we're not stupid. We know we're called Gred and Forge." "What's all this noise?" Percy Weasley stuck his head through the door, looking disapproving. He had clearly gotten halfway through unwrapping his presents too. He carried a lumpy sweater over his arm, which Fred seized. "P for prefect! Get it on, Percy, come on, we're all wearing ours, even Harry got one." "I don't want," said Percy thickly, as the twins forced the sweater over his head, knocking his glasses askew. "And you're not sitting with the prefects today either," said George. "Christmas is time for family." They frog-marched Percy from the room, his arms pinned to his side by his sweater. Harry had never in all his life had such a Christmas dinner. 100 fat roast turkeys, mountains of roast and boiled potatoes, platters of of chipolatas, tureens of platters of chipolatas, mountains of roast and boiled potatoes, platters of chipolatas, tureens of buttered peas, silver boats of thick, rich gravy and cranberry sauce, and stacks of wizard crackers every few feet along the table. These fantastic party favors were nothing like the feeble muggle ones the Dursleys usually bought, with their little plastic toys and the flimsy paper hats inside. Harry pulled a wizard cracker with Fred, and it didn't just bang, it went off with a blast like a cannon and engulfed them in a cloud of blue smoke, while from the inside exploded a rear admiral's hat and several live white mice. Up at the high table, Dumbledore had swapped his pointed wizard's hat for a flowered bonnet, and was chuckling merry at a joke Professor Flitwick had just read him. Flaming Christmas puddings followed the turkey. Percy nearly broke his teeth on a silver sickle embedded in his slice. Harry watched Hagrid getting redder and redder in the face as he called for more wine, finally kissing Professor McGonagall on the cheek, who, to Harry's amazement, giggled and blushed, her top hat lopsided. When Harry finally left the table, he was laden down with a stack of things out of the crackers, including a pack of non-explodable luminous balloons, a grow-your-own warts kit, and his very own new wizard chess set. The white mice had disappeared, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were going to end up as Mrs. Norris's Christmas dinner. Harry and the Weasleys spent a happy afternoon having a furious snowball fight on the grounds. Then, cold, wet, and gasping for breath, they returned to the fire in the Gryffindor common room, where Harry broke in his new chess set by losing spectacularly to Ron. He suspected he wouldn't have lost so badly if Percy hadn't tried to help him out so much. After a meal of turkey sandwiches, crumpets, trifle, and Christmas cake, everyone felt too full and sleepy to do much before bed, except sit and watch Percy chase Fred and George all over Gryffindor Tower because they'd stolen his prefect badge. It had been Harry's best Christmas day ever, yet something had been nagging at the back of his mind all day. Not until he climbed into bed was he free to think about it, the invisibility cloak and whoever had sent it. Ron, full of turkey and cake, and with nothing mysterious to bother him, fell asleep almost as soon as he'd drawn the curtains of his four-poster. Harry leaned over the side of his own bed and pulled the cloak from under it. His father's. This had been his father's. He let the material flow over his hands, smoother than silk, light as air. "Use it well," the note had said. He had to try it now. He slipped out of bed and wrapped the cloak around himself. Looking down at his legs, he saw only moonlight and shadows. It was a very funny feeling. Use it well. Suddenly, Harry felt wide awake. The whole of Hogwarts was open to him in this cloak. Excitement flooded through him as he stood there in the dark and silence. He could go anywhere in this, anywhere, and Filch would never know. Ron grunted in his sleep. Should Harry wake him? Something held him back. His father's cloak. He felt this time, the first time he wanted to use it. Alone. He crept out of the dormitory, down the stairs, across the common room, and climbed through the portrait hall. "Who's there?" squawked the fat lady. Harry said nothing. He walked quickly down the corridor. Where should he go? He stopped, his heart racing, and then thought, and then it came to him. The restricted section in the library. He'd be able to read as long as he liked, as long as it took to find out who Flamel was. He set off, drawing the invisibility cloak tight around him as he walked. The library was pitch black and very eerie. Harry lit a lamp to see his way along the rows of books. The lantern looked as if it was floating along in mid-air, and even as though Harry could feel his arm supporting it, the sight gave him the creeps. The restricted section was right at the back of the library. Stepping carefully over the rope that separated these books from the rest of the library, he held up his lantern and read the titles. They didn't tell him much. Their peeling, faded gold letters spelled words in languages Harry couldn't understand. Some had no title at all. One book had a dark stain on it that looked horribly like blood. The hairs on the back of Harry's neck prickled. Maybe he was imagining it, maybe not, but he thought a faint whispering was coming from one of the books, as though they knew someone was there who shouldn't be. He had to start somewhere. Setting the lamp down carefully on the floor, he looked along the bottom shelf for an interesting-looking book. A large black and silver volume caught his eye. He pulled it out with difficulty because it was very heavy, and balancing it on his knee, let it fall open. A piercing, blood-curdling shriek split the silence. The book was screaming. Harry snapped it shut, but the shriek went on and on, one high, unbroken, ear-splitting note. He stumbled backward and knocked over his lamp, which went out at once. Panicking, he heard footsteps coming down the corridor outside. Stuffing the shrieking book back onto the shelf, he ran for it. He passed Filch in the doorway. Filch's pale, wide eyes looked straight through him, and Harry slipped under Filch's outstretched arm and streaked off up the corridor, the book's shrieks still ringing in his ears. He came to a sudden halt in front of a tall suit of armor. He had been so busy getting away from the library he hadn't paid attention to where he was going. Perhaps because it was dark, he hadn't recognized where he was at all. There was a suit of armor near the kitchens, he knew, but he must be 5 floors above there. "You asked me to come directly to you, Professor. If anyone was wandering around at night and somebody's been in the library, restricted section." Harry felt the blood drain out of his face. Wherever he was, Filch must know a shortcut because his soft, greasy voice was getting nearer, and to his horror, it was Snape who replied, "The restricted section. Well, they can't be far. We'll catch them." Harry stood rooted to the spot as Filch and Snape came around the corner ahead. They couldn't see him, of course, but it was a narrow corridor, and if they came much nearer, they'd knock right into him. The cloak didn't stop him from being solid. He backed away as quietly as he could. A door stood ajar to his left. It was his only hope. He squeezed through it, holding his breath, trying not to move it, and to his relief, he managed to get inside the room without them noticing anything. They walked straight past, and Harry leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, listening to their footsteps dying away. That had been close. Very close. It was a few seconds before he noticed anything about the room in which he'd hidden. It looked like an unused classroom. The dark shapes of the desks and chairs were piled against the walls, and there was an upturned waste paper basket, but propped against the wall facing him was something that didn't look as if it belonged there, something that looked as if someone had just put it there to keep it out of the way. It was a magnificent mirror, as high as the ceiling, with an ornate gold frame standing on 2 clawed feet. There was an inscription carved around the top. Arised straw, eru oit ube kafru, oit on warsi. His panic fading now that there was no sound of Filch and Snape, Harry moved nearer to the mirror, wanting to look at himself but seeing no reflection again. He stepped in front of it. He had to clap his hands to his mouth to stop himself from screaming. He whirled around. His heart was pounding far more furiously than when the book had screamed, for he had not seen only himself in the mirror, but a whole crowd of people standing right behind him. But the room was empty. Breathing very fast, he turned slowly back to the mirror. There he was, reflected in it, white and scared-looking, and there, reflected behind him, were at least 10 others. Harry looked over his shoulder, but still no one was there. Or were they all invisible too? Was he, in fact, in a room full of invisible people, and this mirror's trick was that it reflected them, invisible or not? He looked in the mirror again. A woman standing right behind his reflection was smiling at him and waving. He reached out a hand and felt the air behind him. If she was really there, he'd touch her. Their reflections were so close together, but he felt only air. She and the others existed only in the mirror. She was a very pretty woman. She had dark red hair and her eyes are just like mine. Harry thought, edging a little closer to the glass. Bright green, exactly the same shape, but then he noticed that she was crying. Smiling, but crying at the same time. The tall, thin, black-haired man standing next to her put his arm around her. He wore glasses, and his hair was very untidy. It stuck up at the back, just the way Harry's did. Harry was so close to the mirror now that his nose was nearly touching that of his reflection. "Mom? Dad?" he whispered. They just looked at him, smiling. And slowly, Harry looked into the faces of other people in the mirror, and saw pairs of green eyes just like his, other noses like his, even an old little man who looked as though he had Harry's knobby knees. Harry was looking at his family for the first time in his life. The Potters smiled and waved at Harry, and he stared hungrily back at them, his hands pressed flat against the glass as though he was hoping to fall right through it and reach them. He had a powerful kind of ache inside him, half joy, half terrible sadness. How long he stood there, he did not know. The reflections did not fade, and he looked and looked until a distant noise brought him back to his senses. He couldn't stay here. He had to find his way back to bed. He tore his eyes away from his mother's face, whispered, "I'll come back," and hurried from the room. "You could have woken me up," said Ron crossly. "You can come tonight. I'm going back. I want to show you the mirror." "I'd like to see your mom and dad," Ron said eagerly. "And I want to see all your family, all the Weasleys. You'll be able to show me all your brothers and everyone." "You can see them any old time," said Ron. "Just come round to my house this summer. Anyway, maybe it only shows dead people. Shame about not finding Flamel, though. Have some bacon or something. Why aren't you eating anything?" Harry couldn't eat. He had seen his parents and would be seeing them again tonight. He had almost forgotten about Flamel. It didn't seem very important anymore. Who cared what the three-headed dog was guarding? Why did it matter if Snape stole it, really? "Are you all right?" said Ron. "You look odd." What Harry feared most was that he might not be able to find the mirror room again. With Ron covered in the cloak too, they had to walk much more slowly the next night. They tried retracing Harry's route from the library, wandering around the dark passageways for nearly an hour. "I'm freezing," said Ron. "Let's forget it and go back." "No," Harry hissed. "I know it's here somewhere." They passed the ghost of the tall witch gliding in the opposite direction, but saw no one else. Just as Ron started moaning that his feet were dead with cold, Harry spotted the suit of armor. "It's here, just here, yes." They pushed the door open. Harry dropped the cloak from around his shoulders and ran to the mirror. There they were. His mother and father beamed at the sight of him. "See," Harry whispered. "I can't see anything. Look at them, all. There were loads of them. I can only see you." "Look in it properly. Go on, stand where I am." Harry stepped aside, but with Ron just in front of the mirror, he couldn't see his family anymore. Just Ron in his paisley pajamas. Ron, though, was staring, transfixed at his image. "Look at me," he said. "Can you see all your family standing around you?" "No. I'm alone, but I'm different. I look older, and I'm head boy." "What?" "I am. I'm wearing the badge like Bill used to. And I'm holding up the house cup and the Quidditch cup. I'm Quidditch captain, too." Ron tore his eyes away from the splendid sight to look excitedly at Harry. "Do you think this mirror shows the future?" "How can it? All my family are dead. Let me have another look. You had it to yourself all last night. Give me a bit more time. You're only holding the Quidditch cup. What's interesting about that? I want to see my parents." "Don't push me." A sudden noise out in the corridor put an end to their discussion. They hadn't realized how loudly they'd been talking. "Quick!" Ron threw the cloak back over them as the luminous eyes of Mrs. Norris came round the door. Ron and Harry stood quite still, both thinking the same thing. Did the cloak work on cats? After what seemed like an age, she turned and left. "This isn't safe. She might have gone for Filch. I bet she heard us. Come on." And Ron pulled Harry out of the room. The snow still hadn't melted the next morning. "Want to play chess, Harry?" said Ron. "No." "Why don't we go and visit Hagrid?" "No, you go." "I know what you're thinking about, Harry. That mirror. Don't go back tonight." "Why not?" "I don't know. I've got a bad feeling about it. And anyway, you've had too many close shaves already. Filch, Snape, and Mrs. Norris are wandering around. So what if they can't see you? What if they walk into you? What if you knock something over?" "You sound like Hermione." "I'm serious, Harry. Don't go." But Harry only had one thought in his head, which was to get back in front of the mirror, and Ron wasn't going to stop him. That third night, he found his way more quickly than before. He was walking so fast, he knew he was making more noises than what was wise, but he didn't meet anyone. And there were his mother and father smiling at him again, and one of his grandfathers nodding happily. Harry sank down to sit on the floor in front of the mirror. There was nothing to stop him from staying here all night with his family. Nothing at all. Except...
So, back again, Harry.
Harry felt as though his insides had turned to ice. He looked behind him. Sitting on one of the desks by the wall was none other than Albus Dumbledore. Harry must have walked straight past him, so desperate to get to the mirror that he hadn't noticed him. I didn't see you, sir.
Strange how nearsighted being invisible can make you,
said Dumbledore, and Harry was relieved to see that he was smiling.
So,
said Dumbledore, slipping off the desk to sit on the floor with Harry.
You, like hundreds before you, have discovered the delights of the Mirror of Erised.
I didn't know it was called that, sir.
But I expect you've realized by now what it does.
It shows me my family.
And it showed your friend Ron himself as head boy.
How did you know?
I don't need a cloak to become invisible,
said Dumbledore gently.
Now, can you think what the Mirror of Erised shows us all?
Harry shook his head.
Let me explain. The happiest man on Earth would be able to use the Mirror of Erised like a normal mirror. That is, he would look into it and see himself exactly how he is. Does that help?
Harry thought. Then he said slowly, It shows us what we want. Whatever we want.
Yes and no,
said Dumbledore quietly.
It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest desires of our hearts. You, who have never known your family, see them standing around you. Ronald Weasley, who has always been overshadowed by his brothers, sees himself standing alone, the best of all of them. However, this mirror will give us neither knowledge nor truth. Men have wasted away before it, entranced by what they have seen, or been driven mad not knowing if what it shows is real or even possible. The mirror will be moved to a new home tomorrow, Harry, and I ask you to not go looking for it again. You will now be prepared. It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Remember that. Now, why don't you put that admirable cloak back on and get off to bed?
Harry stood up. Sir, Professor Dumbledore, can I ask you something?
Obviously, you've just done so.
Dumbledore smiled.
You may ask me, however, one more thing.
What do you see when you look in the mirror?
I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks.
Harry stared.
One can never have enough socks,
said Dumbledore.
Another Christmas has come and gone. I didn't get a single pair. People will insist on giving me books.
It was only when he was back in bed that it struck Harry that Dumbledore might not have been quite truthful. But then, he thought, as he shoveled Scabbers off his pillow, it had been quite a personal question. Chapter 13. Nicholas Flamel. Dumbledore had convinced Harry not to go looking for the Mirror of Erised again, and for the rest of the Christmas holidays, the invisibility cloak stayed folded at the bottom of his trunk. Harry wished he could forget what he'd seen in the mirror as easily, but he couldn't. He started having nightmares. Over and over again, he dreamed about his parents disappearing in a flash of green light, while a high voice cackled with laughter. You see, Dumbledore was right. That mirror could drive you mad, said Ron, when Harry told him about these dreams. Hermione, who came back the day before term started, took a different view of things. She was torn between horror at the idea of Harry being out of bed, roaming the school 3 nights in a row, if Filch had caught you, and disappointment that he hadn't at least found out who Nicholas Flamel was. They'd almost given up hope of ever finding Flamel in a library book, even though Harry was still sure he'd read the name somewhere. Once term had started, they were back to skimming through books for 10 minutes during their breaks. Harry had even less time than the other two because Quidditch practice had started again. Wood was working the team harder than ever before. Even the endless rain that had replaced the snow couldn't dampen his spirits. The Weasleys complained that Wood was becoming a fanatic, but Harry was on Wood's side. If they won the next match against Hufflepuff, they would overtake Slytherin in the House Championship for the first time in 7 years. Quite apart from wanting to win, Harry found that he had fewer nightmares when he was tired out after training. Then, during one particularly wet and muddy practice session, Wood gave the team a bit of bad news. He'd just gotten very angry with the Weasleys, who kept dive-bombing each other and pretending to fall off their brooms. "Will you stop messing around?" he yelled. "That's exactly the sort of thing that'll lose us the match. Snape's refereeing this time, and he'll be looking for any excuse to knock points off Gryffindor." George Weasley really did fall off his broom at these words. "Snape's refereeing?" he spluttered through a mouthful of mud. When's he ever refereed a Quidditch match? He's not going to be fair if we might overtake Slytherin." The rest of the team landed next to George to complain too. "It's not my fault," said Wood. "We've just got to make sure we play a clean game, so Snape hasn't got an excuse to pick on us." Which was all very well, thought Harry, but he had another reason for not wanting Snape near him while he was playing Quidditch. The rest of the team hung back to talk to one another as usual at the end of practice, but Harry headed straight back to the Gryffindor common room, where he found Ron and Hermione playing chess. Chess was the only thing Hermione ever lost at, something Harry and Ron thought was very good for her. "Don't talk to me for a moment," said Ron when Harry sat down next to him. "I need to concent." He caught sight of Harry's face. "What's the matter with you? You look terrible." Speaking quietly so that no one else would hear, Harry told the other two about Snape's sudden, sinister desire to be a Quidditch referee. "Don't play," said Hermione at once. "Say you're ill," said Ron. "Pretend to break your leg," Hermione suggested. "Really break your leg," said Ron. "I can't," said Harry. "There isn't a reserve seeker. If I back out, Gryffindor can't play at all." At that moment, Neville toppled into the common room. How he managed to climb through the portrait hole was anyone's guess because his legs had been stuck together with what they recognized at once as the leg locker curse. He must have had to bunny hop all the way to Gryffindor Tower. Everyone fell over laughing except Hermione, who leapt up and performed the counter curse. Neville's legs sprang apart and he got to his feet, trembling. "What happened?" Hermione asked him, leading him over to sit with Harry and Ron. "Malfoy," said Neville shakily. "I met him outside the library. He said he'd be looking for someone to practice that on." "Go to Professor McGonagall," Hermione urged Neville. "Report him." Neville shook his head. "I don't want more trouble," he mumbled. "You've got to stand up to him, Neville," said Ron. "He's used to walking all over people, but that's no reason to lie down in front of him and make it easier." "There's no need to tell me that. I'm not brave enough to be in Gryffindor. Malfoy's already done that," Neville choked out. Harry felt in the pocket of his robes and pulled out a chocolate frog, the very last one from the box Hermione had given him for Christmas. He gave it to Neville, who looked as though he might cry. "You're worth 12 of Malfoy," Harry said. "The Sorting Hat chose you for Gryffindor, didn't? And where's Malfoy? In stinking Slytherin." Neville's lips twitched in a weak smile as he unwrapped the frog. "Thanks, Harry. I think I'll go to bed. Do you want a card? You collect them, don't you?" As Neville walked away, Harry looked at the famous wizard card. "Dumbledore again," he said. "He was the first one I ever—" He gasped. He stared at the back of the card. Then he looked up at Ron and Hermione. "I found him!" he whispered. "I found Flamel! I told you I read the name somewhere before. I read it on the train coming here. Listen to this. Dumbledore is particularly famous for his defeat of the Dark Wizard Grindelwald in 1945, for the discovery of the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel." Hermione jumped to her feet. She hadn't looked so excited since they'd gotten back the marks for their very first piece of homework. "Stay there," she said. She sprinted up the stairs to the girls' dormitories. Harry and Ron barely had time to exchange mystified looks before she was dashing back, an enormous old book in her arms. "I've never thought to look in here," she whispered excitedly. "I got this out of the library weeks ago for a bit of light reading." "Light?" said Ron, but Hermione told him to be quiet until she'd looked something up, and started flicking frantically through the pages, muttering to herself. At last she found what she was looking for. "I knew it! I knew it!"